I will start by outlining this talk, which will address processes of nationalizing citizenship by analyzing approaches to minority and migration policies in Slovenian context in the last 30 years since the independence in 1991. I will show how the securitization approach of these policies works to protect the national ideologies, which is often resulting in poor conditions and thin rights of minority and migrant populations. In Central Eastern Europe, societies as elsewhere are multi-ethnic, and Slovenia is no exception. Despite the census data that are often used to portray the country as one of the most ethnically homogeneous of the Yugoslavia successor states, emphasizing, for example, that the foreign population in Slovenia only amounts to 3 to 4%. After the disintegration of Yugoslavia, Slovenia as a newly established state was viewed internationally largely as a success story of the post-socialist transition. The depiction of the success, however, neglected the critical elements of the nation-building processes that were based to a certain extent and against a certain population on the exclusion of minorities from the allegedly ethnically homogeneous national body. So I will aim to show in this talk how Slovenian citizenship was developed as ethnic citizenship in an ethnic democracy, and how it was related to the protectionist-prone ideologies of building a young national state since the early 90s. So I will begin by outlining the concept of citizenship and discuss how its processes of ethnicization resulted in producing statelessness of minority groups. I will then briefly introduce the recent migration history of Slovenia, critically analyzing the notion of autochthony on which migration and minority regimes were based, and the role of autochthony in the building of the principles of inclusion and exclusion, inclusion of the old minorities, the Hungarian and the Italian minority, and the exclusion of the so-called non-autochthonous minorities, or the so-called new minorities that were later framed as new minorities, meaning the former Yugoslavs, and lately, since the 2000, migrants from outside Europe. The theoretical baseline as a background of this talk is the notion of citizenship as proposed by Etienne Balibar and as feminist scholars, for example, Mira Rival-Davis, Iris Marion Young, Ruth Lister, and others, who conceptualized citizenship in terms of democratization processes and equalization of people through their activity in a polity. So politically, citizenship stands for generating polities of equals. It creates, in the words of Arendt, worldliness of people, their membership in a world that normatively and politically extends beyond ethnic determinism or labor market utilitarianism, based on which several minority regimes derive from. So looking at minority and migration regimes developing Europe-wide and including Slovenia, we see citizenship originally denoting membership in a community of equals, becoming reduced to a status to a passport-based citizenship, or in other words, to an administrative criterion defining membership either by virtue of birth, so the jus sanguinis principle, or by virtue of residence, the jus soli principle. So only a passport citizen is recognized as the member of the national state with the right to vote, schooling, health protection, pension, and language, and so on. So in this talk, I try to argue that a reductionist view of status-based citizenship that rests on categorizing migrants and minorities on the deserved, the non-deserved, the deserved refugees from Syria, the non-deserved economic migrants, this dualism that is often presented in public discourse on migration, the autochthonous minorities such as Italian and Hungarian, and the non-autochthonous such as former Yugoslavs. So I argue that such bordering of people produces statelessness as de facto otherness. So personal circumstances such as the fact of not belonging to a specific national community either by virtue of birth or by virtue of soil territory becomes the marker that generates inclusion, exclusion, and so becomes the marker that perpetuates exclusion of minority populations. Statelessness nowadays arises from the fact that the person, minorities, migrants, has found himself or herself outside of the community into which she or he was born. For example, Hannah Arendt thematized the factual statelessness in the case of the Jews during the Nazi era. But today, it seems that statelessness can be applied or is applicable to any other category of people that are regarded as the other. So we see the extension of this statelessness even in cases when migrants are de jure citizens. And I will try to show this on the Slovenian case. So the production and the reproduction of the divisions that I mentioned, the deserved, the non-deserved, the economic, the political migrants, the autochthonous, the non-autochthonous. So this constant bordering that is also coupled with the populist opponents of multiculturalism produces migrants as impossible subjects of integration. An independent state since 1991, Slovenia has seen increased immigration from the late 90s onwards, whereas migration to Slovenia began already in the 1950s in the former Yugoslav context. So the intra-state mobility in Yugoslav period was a strong trend due to industrialization and urbanization that made Slovenia a popular destination for people looking for jobs, particularly from south and east regions of the former Yugoslavia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Kosovo. These trends had significantly affected the composition of Slovenia's foreign population, since the vast majority came from Yugoslavia's successor states. If we are looking at the last 30 years of migration minority regimes in Slovenia, it's possible to differentiate three periods of migration to the country, so in this independence period, and all, as always, migration are related to specific political, economic, and social developments. Firstly, the wars following the collapse of Yugoslavia in the early 90s forced many refugees to seek shelter in the country. Secondly, the first decade of 2000 started to attract so-called new migrants from other Yugoslav successor states, but also for the first time in this period, a notable increase was detected among migrants from post-Soviet states, from Asia, Africa, Latin America. And the third period, so thirdly, Slovenia's EU membership and the transposition of European Union directives since 2004 also influenced migration from all over the world. And the last but not least, we should add the so-called refugee crisis in 2015-16 as yet another period that triggered responses that line up with the reductionist understanding of citizenship that I outlined before. In 91, thousands of people from various regions of Yugoslavia were forced out of their homes, and by 1992, Slovenia was hosting about 70,000 up to 100,000, the figures vary, refugees, initially from Croatia, later mostly from Bosnia-Herzegovina, some from Kosovo. The Slovene authorities considered the people fleeing in the country to be here only temporary, and consequently policies focused merely on the so-called temporary protection of forced migrants, so in this period of Yugoslav wars. Not recognizing the status of refugees, which left many who settled later in the country without proper protection and in a precarious position with no right to work, for example. And this temporary statelessness for several people extended for as long as 10 years. So it's usual that this temporary statuses are conditioning large part of minorities' lives. It's not only the Slovenian case. If we go to the second period, so one period, the 1990, the war in Yugoslavia, the second period, early 2000, 2001, saw the emergence of the so-called immigrant crisis in the country, when stigmatizing and discriminatory discourses and policies on so-called illegal migrants. This was the period where the illegality was launched in public discourse, so they gained ground in the country. We've analyzed media discourses that were largely triggered by inappropriate responses by the political elites at that time that were actually the first to frame migration, especially from more distant places that I mentioned before, so from post-Soviet countries, from Asia, Africa, as a threat to the Slovenian nation with the plea that they should be removed from the country. This was also the period that saw civil initiatives that were launched whenever the nearby local population felt threatened by the presence of the detention center that began to, and people began to resist the settling of migrants. In this period, we saw voices of the people around the country spread like wildfire, encouraging the belief that Slovenia, after the fleeing of the Bosnian refugees, was under threat yet again. So after the war in Bosnia, this was the second period when we saw the protectionist policies adopted, mainly to safeguard the border and limiting the prospects for migrant integration. In the early 2000s, Slovenia's economic situation had been characterized by high levels of economic growth. This was the period of an increase in job vacancies, greater activity rates, and a decline in official unemployment figures. All these were the trends that contributed to an increased migration from different parts of the world, and migrants mostly, also as a consequence of protectionist policies, filled positions that are usually termed as 3D jobs, so the dirty, the dangerous, the demanding jobs, so jobs that are unattractive to the local population, particularly in the lower sectors of the economy. In 2008, however, the economic conditions globally affected Slovenia as well, and specifically hit hard the vulnerable positions of non-ethnic Slovenians, especially those employed in the lower sectors of the industry. In the perspective of the country's policies towards minorities and migration, two cases are particularly relevant. One is the erased, and the second is the unrecognized minorities. Both groups are comprising former co-nationals in socialist Yugoslavia. In February 92, thousands were removed from the registry of permanent residents of Slovenia without prior notification. This illegal and unconstitutional administrative measure later became known as erasure, which left more than 20,000 people statusless and in lines with the debate from previously, stateless, so without rights. The erasure constitutes what appears as a mechanism of the nation building that is based on ethnic origin, on ethnic ground, protecting the majority, in this case against the Yugoslav minority. Migration history in Slovenia shows that many people from other Yugoslav successor states have settled in Slovenia over decades, so as I said before, since the 1950s. And they now represent a sizable share of the population. If we look at the labor market statistics, they would amount to more than 10% of the population. Despite the fact that many have acquired Slovenian citizenship, they remain without recognized collective minority rights. This, of course, notably affects the political, the social, cultural, economic position in the country, that also visibly differs from the position of the two recognized national minorities, the Hungarian and the Italian minorities that were recognized as autochthonous minorities and granted a myriad of rights, or also transposed since the Yugoslav period to the new Slovenian constitution. The so-called migration crisis from 2015 and 16 can be viewed as yet another case of ethnic nationalism that was mixed with, we analyzed the public discourses with populist appeals of securitization. We've analyzed in one research the parliamentary debates on the 7 migration-related laws that were adopted in Slovenia in this period of 2 years, to 15 and to 16. And the frame analysis showed that primarily the political debate treated the refugee crisis as a security issue, as a threat to the society, to the culture. Also, pronounced discourse was questioning state stability, borders that were depicted as threatened and overflooded by the foreigner. If I go now to this notion that I mentioned at the beginning of autochthony. So several analyses of minority and migration regimes in Slovenia have already previously defined or analyzed autochthony as a controversial concept, and it played a crucial role in defining minority regimes. The establishment of the state was actually founded on a strong notion of ethnicity, so back in the early 1990s. The need to position the Slovenian ethnic majority against the other. This was the period of establishing of the state, positioning the state against the former Yugoslavs. We could see that the soil and the blood principles prevailed in the legal, political, and social discourses and practices surrounding the idea of the creation of the Slovenian nation since the independence, and we could see that this autochthony is actually a primary principle or marker of the Slovenian ethnic nationalism. So autochthonous can help us understand that Slovenian statehood was actually not formed as not that much on civic, but on ethnic grounds, and it was formed on the primacy of rights of the ethnic nation. Although the constitution portrays the state as an equal union of all its citizenship. So if we look at the international literature, we can see that the ethnic citizenship of this type is perceived as an exclusionary type of nationalism that praises one ethnic group over another and bypasses democratic ideas of citizenship and civic equality that I outlined as a political and normative framework of this discussion at the beginning. When you analyze minority and migration regimes more in detail, you see, however, an interesting thing that autochthonous was actually not designed by its positive, so to protect minorities, but rather by its negative pole, so from whom the Slovenian majority should be protected. So minority regimes were thus created to protect the majority national group from the non-autochthonous populations. Autochthonous was not primarily introduced so to grant minority protection to Italian and Hungarian minority, but to ensure that those not considered autochthonous would actually not be entitled to protection. So this is how autochthonous is reproduced as a marker of ethnic nationalism. So the Slovenian minority regime, therefore, worked to protect one minority, so the established, the old minorities, to disable the protection of another. And I find this an important element that based on which we can understand also later migration regimes. For example, the refugee crisis of 2015 that we can see could fall into this schemata of reproduction of ethnic democracy. Italian and Hungarian communities, so recognized as old minorities in Slovenian context, were granting rights, and it was said in the documents, for not posing a threat, and also, which is important, in expectation of reciprocal protection of the Slovenian minority in the neighboring Italy and Hungary. So these two minorities were recognized and protected already in the Yugoslav period, in the Constitution of the Socialist Republic of Slovenia in the 63, followed by the last Slovenian constitution in Socialist Yugoslavia from 74. So we saw that the new Slovenian constitution from 91 transposed these former Yugoslav directives, but it stopped here. So the constitution from 91, since the beginning of the independence, does not say a word about numerous citizens who live in Slovenia and have been born in one of the other former Yugoslav republics. So consequently, Croats, Serbians, Bosnians, Macedonians, Montenegrins, who constitute the largest share of non-ethnically born, have been defined since the independence as new migrants. So this was the labeling in the official legal legislation and also in public discourse. So new migrants, although they were not admitted as immigrants, and although they have lived in Slovenia for decades prior to the formation of statehood. And again, we can see parallels to contemporary migration regimes, and again, making parallels with the refugee crisis, and now possibly with the Afghan refugees and so on. So the ethnic nationalism of the Slovenian state reached its ultimate exclusionary peak with the issue of the erasure. It was an act of the erasure from the registry of permanent residency. The erasure happened in 1992, and it meant the deprivation of a status of permanent residence that in former Yugoslavia was the basis from which rights and other entitlements were derived. So the erased were consequently left without any legal status by this administrative act, and their situation resembled to the situation of illegal migrants, although they have been living in the country for a long time. The erasure was framed by the authorities at that time as a personal problem of the erased people who refused to apply for Slovenian citizenship in the independence period. It is significant that most of the erased, or at least one of their parents, were born in other republics of former Yugoslavia, which is an indicator that shows that the erasure was based on ethnic grounds. And the results of this administrative act left 1,000 people, more than 20,000 people, left so statusless, as we discussed before, so without documents, healthcare, social security, denied the right to work, etc. The erased lost their place in the world. They were rendered, as argued by Jalušić and Dedić in the book on the erased, bare humans, powerless and deprived of the place to be seen and heard from. Studies confirmed that the erased were the victims of a digital cleansing, and the erasure was described by several research as the civic death of thousands and as a policy of severe social exclusion. It is closely related to the foundation of the new state and the definition of citizenship and residence as a process of this dialectics of inclusion and exclusion. So erasure is related to the formation and this ethnic citizenship with the formation of the new state. The precarious position of the erased is still not resolved after 3 decades. This period has witnessed huge efforts, first on the part of the Association of the Erased, their legal representatives, critical public, NGOs, protests, activities, national, international human rights organizations. Numerous publications have been published region-wide and broader that assured not only the recognition of the unconstitutional act of the erasure, but also paved the path towards regularization of the status of the erased and compensation. In 2012, Slovenia was found responsible for violations of rights of the erased people by the European Court of Human Rights. This was actually a landmark judgment, and the court also ordered the state to set up a compensation scheme for the erased people. According to this judgment, the state adopted the act regulating the compensation for the damage to persons erased from the permanent population register. And this act entered into force in December 2013. But since then, we see that several issues still remain unsolved. Several people still face difficulties in restoring the status. The problem is that the claims have remained in the sole responsibility of the individuals. We have seen inadequate measures to compensate the injustices. The problem of family reunion is still there. The issue of apology, the state hasn't admitted and apologized for this act that actually breached the Constitution. Okay, so I will bring this analysis to a closing part by saying that I was trying to outline that the Slovene statehood was established on minority and migration regimes that developed together with the development of the new state, and that we've seen back in the 90s, and we keep seeing the policies that are foregrounding what I outlined as ethnic citizenship. So minority regimes often function in such a way that they retain that they perpetuate these borders of exclusion and inclusion, exclusion and separation from the other. When granting certain rights, the Yugoslav minorities are judged against the next other, so against migrants that are coming to Slovenia from the Middle East, from Africa, from Asia. The situation of the Syrian refugees, if we remember, was judged against the economic migrants coming from Pakistan, from Afghanistan, and so on. So we have these dialectics of inclusion and exclusion. So notoriously, we see that the Arendtian term of the right to have rights is often denied through these dialectics, through these circular conditionality processes and selective admission to citizenship, to asylum, to the labor market, to culture, and so on. So I have argued that the policies that are governing migration and minority regimes, not only in Slovenia, but we are seeing these trends Europe-wide, can be understood as policies of circular conditionality that are expanding and reproducing statelessness. So if citizenship, if I go back with which I started, if citizenship refers to processes that are shaping citizens as political beings in a polity of equals, then based on minority and migration regimes, we are experiencing de-citizenization and reproduction of statelessness. And again, in the situation of 2015-16, we've seen again the Foucauldian governmentality at work, how asylum system has been changing to protect the European values, how the border regimes plastically adapted to mobility. We've seen how policies have been bending and stretching in the attempts to control migration, and the control that was accompanied by surveillance, documentation, numbering, classifying, fingerprinting, X-raying, and so on. So all this technology of structural restriction or of structural violence. In spite of de facto transnationalization or globalization trends, we still witness the nationally embedded frameworks are at work across several states, Europe-wide and worldwide, and the need to readdress some of the persistent national ideologies with or within globalizing national states that are today recognized as multicultural societies has become obvious, perhaps more so than ever in the past. So the question raised by this analysis is that for the possible ways of envisioning citizenship for a globalized world in the future, where the principle of equal action among various populations in a polity, so regardless the status-based citizenship, would be observed. So we are seeing, and in your project you've also unraveled how people's lives, how people's identities are shaped by their local, national, regional, transnational alliances, political communities that develop cross borders, how multi-layered citizenship are crossing borders and boundaries of national states. And I would conclude that future answers for the transnationalizing world, one of the future answers might be seen in, as Norberto Bobbio, an Italian philosopher and political scientist, said, in viewing migration not anymore as an exception, so as a digression from the norms, right? But rather to learn from the mobilities, from contemporary mobile commons, and also from, of course, the other solidarity, human rights-oriented initiatives that have engaged in the last decades in massive struggles against nationalist and populist elements of migration and minority management. So I'll conclude by this plea for instilling statelessness. So in the redesigning or reimagining migration and minority policies. Thank you very much.